Morning, everyone. We'll get started here in a minute. We'll just wait to let everyone get or join the webinar, and then we'll get started. Okay, we'll get started here this morning. So hi, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the webinar or nutrient management webinar series. I'm Matthew Wells with Lethbridge County, and I'll be your host for the upcoming presentations. This series is brought to you by the collaborative efforts of Lethbridge County, County of Warner, and County of Newell. Some housekeeping items before we start. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the nutrient management website, the Lethbridge County YouTube channel, and the Lethbridge County website once the webinar series has been completed. A link to the recordings will be sent out to all participants in case you'd like to review the sessions or were unable to participate in one or more of the presentations. Any questions that you have can be typed in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen and will be answered once both presentations have been completed. Please feel free to utilize the chat box. I see a few different names here today. So last time, for those that missed the last webinar, we had everyone post what town, province, state that you were watching from. If you wouldn't mind doing the same, it would be greatly appreciated. It's interesting to know where everyone is from and how far of a reach the webinar has. So we have CEU credits available for each presentation and will be shown at the end of the session today. Both are QR codes. All you'll need is a certified crop advisor app to scan to receive credits for today's presentation. Lastly, the webinar is scheduled for 1 hour each day. However, we can extend it a little bit based on how many questions we get if we need to. So we'll start off with our first panelist today. So Edith Olson will discuss soil salinity. Edith Olson has an honors degree in soil science from University of Aberdeen, Scotland, which I found out that is cool. That was pretty sweet to see. And a PhD in water and land resources from University of Alberta, Edmonton. Edith was a technician, then research associate with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Lethbridge, then left for an instructor role at Lethbridge College. She's been at LC for almost 20 years. Currently, Edith is the chair of engineering technologies and an instructor in environmental sciences and agriculture, teaching courses in soils, water, and research. Edith has also taught part-time at the University of Alberta and University of Lethbridge. Welcome, Edith.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Matthew. So I'll get going with the presentation this morning. It's going to be about reclaiming salt-affected soils. So let's just see if I can share screen and bring up this presentation. Our host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Yeah, give me 2 seconds.
He doesn't want me to give this presentation after all. I could just talk, but that wouldn't be the same.
No, it wouldn't. Give me 2 seconds. I thought I had this figured out last time. I don't know why it's doing this. Everyone chat, stop video, mute. Steven, do you have
I don't either.
I wonder why you didn't have this trouble last time. Sorry, everyone. I thought I had this all figured out.
Yeah, it's not like on my face.
I won't let anyone.
It won't let me like let her share either. So in these tabs, scroll down to the screen sharing heading.
Under my settings. Did that work, Edith, or no?
Let's give it a try. Host has disabled participant screen sharing. That's the
Oh my
message I get.
goodness.
Can we blame the weather outside today in Lethbridge?
Yeah, it is crazy weather out today. Where else can I figure this out? Okay, we'll try this. Okay, we're gonna make you a co-host, Edith, and see if that works.
Okay, let me know when that's done. And I'll try the screen share again.
Should be good.
All right, let's try screen share. Oh, look at that. I think we're on a roll here. Can you see this
Okay,
presentation?
yes, we're good to go. Thanks for the
Excellent.
suggestion, whoever put that in. Much appreciated.
All right. Okay, so good morning, everybody, and thank you very much indeed, Matthew, for that wonderful introduction. As Matthew said, my name is Edith Olson. I am the Chair of Engineering Technologies at Lethbridge College, but I'm also an instructor in environmental sciences and agriculture. So today I'm going to give an overview about reclaiming salt-affected soils. We're not going to talk much today about the causes of salt-affected soils, or even necessarily a lot about how we manage salt-affected soils. The focus this morning is on how we can reclaim these salt-affected soils by getting rid of the salt that's causing us some issues and establishing a higher productivity. So let's take a look. So let's start by this part. You know that you have a salt-affected soil. Well, how do you know that? Well, you probably, let me see if I can do this. It's not going to advance. Okay, how do you know that you've got this salt-affected soil? Well, probably you've seen your soil test results because you've taken your soil samples from your fields into an accredited laboratory, and that laboratory has told you about what the electrical conductivity is of your soils. And that electrical conductivity is a measure of the total salt content in your soil. So perhaps you've seen an electrical conductivity reading that's given you some cause for concern, or perhaps you've noticed that your soil conductivity readings have been going up over the last few years or decades, and you're starting to think, maybe I've got some salt in that soil that I'd rather not was there. Perhaps you've noticed a wavy pattern of crop growth across your fields. This could be due because the salt-affected soils can pop up in patches across our fields, and the rest of the field has got a very normal soil. So the crop is doing just fine in parts of the field and not so good in other parts. And this can lead to this wavy pattern that we can see across our fields. If you've seen salts on the surface, that white stuff that you see on the surface, you definitely know that you have a salt-affected soil. So through the process of water coming up through the soil profile and then evaporating at the soil surface, we've seen these salts accumulating, a clear indication that you definitely have a salt-affected soil. Poor yields. Maybe your whole field is affected by salt, and so you've seen that you're not getting very good yields from that particular field. You may not have noticed salt being on the surface of the soil in those particular fields, but you're still not getting very good yields. That salt could still be present in your soil. It's just a little bit further down into the soil profile. You're not seeing it manifesting at the soil surface, but it's there and it's affecting your crop growth, even though you can't see it at the soil surface. Another indication that you have a salt-affected soil is perhaps you've seen parts of your field that are not draining very well. That's because of the salt that's in there and the way that we've formed this hard pan that is present in the soil profile. And the water's sitting around in parts of your field where you'd wish it would drain away. And if it evaporates and leaves behind the salts behind it, salts on the surface, oh yes, you definitely have a salt-affected soil. And if you see the prevalence of salt-tolerant weeds growing around your crops and in your fields, then you definitely know you have a salt-affected soil. So how can we deal with our salt-affected soils? Well, the first thing to know is to figure out, well, what kind of salt-affected soil do you have? Is it a saline soil? Is it a saline sodic soil? or is it a sodic soil? So we take a look at this diagram that you can see on your screen, and it's going to indicate to you, based on things like electrical conductivity, the exchangeable sodium percentage, and the sodium absorption ratio, as to what category your salt-affected soil falls into. This one up here is the electrical conductivity. And although the units on this particular diagram are not given in the standard deci-Siemens per meter, they can be read as being exactly the same values as those. A normal soil has an EC of less than 4. Once it starts rising above 4, we know that we have salt-affected soil. The ESP is the exchangeable sodium percentage. Less than 15, normal soil. Greater than 15, now we could be into the sodic soils, or even to the saline sodic soils. And the other thing that we would look at in a diagram like this is the sodium absorption ratio. As that sodium absorption ratio rises above 13, we move from being a saline soil into a saline sodic soil. So anything that has an EC of less than 4, an ESP of less than 15, and a SAR less than 13 is considered a normal soil. And then as these values change, we move into these different kinds of categories of salt-affected soils. Okay, so what does it look like underneath the soil surface? So what we see here is a typical profile for our prairie region soils that are salt-affected. We call these soils solonetzic soils. They belong to one of the 10 soil orders in the Canadian system of soil classification. We might see a topsoil, and then we might see a horizon, an AE horizon, where material has been moved out, salts. And then underneath that, we see a BNT horizon, which we can call the hard pan. It's very dense. It doesn't let air or moisture or roots move easily through this soil. Then a little bit of a transition zone, and down into the layer below, which is where the salts are. It's also a layer which we can find carbonates. So we call this the lime salt layer. These are some of the soils that you might find in the solonetzic soil order: the solonets, the solidized solonets, and the solid. The solonetzic soil is apparently relatively uncommon in Alberta, whereas the solidized solonet soil, you'll find it in eastern and central Alberta. The solid is the most productive of the solonetzic soils, but all of these are in fact salt-affected soils. We can see that horizon down at the bottom of the soil profiles in each of these particular cases, and a BN or a BNT horizon in each of these soil profiles, which is where we're going to find the hard pan, that dense layer. For the solidized solonets, the one in the middle, do you notice the white tops, the tops of the columns? That's salt present at the top of that horizon and underneath the soil. So now that we know we have a salt-affected soils, what options do we have? Well, there are physical, there are chemical, there are leaching, and there is biological things that we can do. And sometimes one is not enough, and we're going to have to use more than one of these techniques so that we can get our soils not to be salt-affected anymore. Are these permanent solutions? Is this something that we're going to do this to our soil and salt is going to disappear and everything's going to be great forever and ever and ever? Problem solved. Unfortunately, that is not going to be the case. Whatever caused the soil salinity in the first place is likely to come back. So these are not permanent solutions. One of the mechanical means that we can use is called deep plowing. Remember that hard pan I talked about present in the soil profile? You want to try and break that up by deep plowing right down to that, breaking up that hard pan. It's been around since the 1950s, this technique, and what it's doing is mixing the hard pan with that lime salt layer. Okay, what's the intention of that? Well, the calcium from the lime is going to replace the sodium on the soil exchange sites. The sodium is the nasty one. That's what's causing us all the issues, whereas calcium is more beneficial to our soils. It can create a whole lot of beneficial things in soils. For example, improved aggregate stability, improved drainage, and improved infiltration. So this would be a good thing if we can mix this and replace all the sodium with the calcium. So what happens here is this lime salt layer has to be within plowing depth, or you're not going to be able to do anything with this plowing operation. And the sodium content of that lime salt layer has to be low enough so that when we're preparing a seed bed, it's not going to be adversely affecting the seeds or the seedlings. Young plants are very sensitive to salt. We also want to make sure that if there's groundwater, saline groundwater at depth, that we're not going to have it moving up. We like to keep that groundwater at least 2 meters underground from the soil surface. That's about 6 feet underground. We don't really want it getting into the root zone because it's saline. So if we have sodic bedrock at depth, we do not want to be plowing deep enough to bring that stuff up and incorporate it into our topsoil in our hard pan. We've just made the problem worse if we do things like that. If you're going to try deep plowing, you should do it when the soil is dry. Okay, is there machinery that can do this? Well, I took a look at some of the literature from ADEX 158-20, and I noticed it talked about some of the equipment that we could use. A single bottom plow, which is very simple, plows a furrow 30 inches deep, 30 inches wide and 24 inches deep, using a single mold bore plow to mix this hard pan in the lime salt layer. This has been an effective method if the soil has been eroded and you don't have much topsoil. Okay, then there's a 3-layer plow where you can use a series of mold boards to transfer topsoil from plowed to unplowed area. You can do a furrow 24 inches wide and 24 inches deep. Then there was another piece of machinery called a wheel plow. This said it was effective in salvaging topsoil, has a lower draft, and is more capable of maintaining a uniform depth of penetration using a large wheel to transfer topsoil from unplowed to plowed areas. It can go 30 inches wide and 30 inches deep. Okay, but is there something else we can use? Yes, subsoilers. Subsoilers are an alternative to deep plowing. Subsoilers were introduced after deep plowing techniques had been investigated because subsoilers are less expensive and they use less time than deep plowing. When I took a look at what these things look like, I was informed that they have parabolic shanks and some models have varying shank configurations. I might be chair of engineering, but I'm not an engineer, so I hope that makes sense to some people out there. Subsoiling or deep dripping is a technique where you have an alternative to deep plowing. The goal of this is to shatter that hard pan, break it up into little pieces, and then it won't be such an issue. Roots, moisture, and air will be able to get through the soil. It's not going to mix the soil horizons like the deep plowing operations do. It's just going to get down there into that hard pan and break it all up. We should also do this when the soil is dry. All right, so that's mechanical methods. What about some of these chemical methods that we can use? Well, what our goal is with these methods is to replace the sodium, which is the bad guy, with calcium, which is the good guy. So how can we do this? One way to do this would be to add very finely ground gypsum. Gypsum is calcium sulfate. So you could add this when the soil is moist and work it into the ground. You can't just put it on the surface. It won't work. You can't just plow it under. That won't work either. You really have to mix it into the soil. Okay, so can we calculate how much of this gypsum to use if this is a method that we're thinking of doing? Yes, you can. Remember we talked about the exchangeable sodium percentage? Well, in this hypothetical example, if we had an exchangeable sodium percentage of 25%, and we knew that the cation exchange capacity of the soil was 18 centimoles of charge for every kilogram of soil, and where our goal is to reduce the exchangeable sodium percentage of the upper 30 centimeters, where we get our crops growing, to 5%. The theoretical calculation tells us we would need about 12,400 kilograms per hectare of gypsum to apply to our soil. Okay, but soils around here tend to have quite a lot of calcium to start with. So is that going to make a difference? I mean, gypsum's calcium sulfate, but is it the only source of calcium? No. our soils are also quite endowed with calcium. So, although this is the theoretical calculation, you better factor in the calcium content already existing in the soil. Okay, here's another chemical method which is not as often used as the gypsum one is. But in this one, you can add sulfur, elemental sulfur, that yellow powder, or you can add sulfuric acid. Okay, how does this work? Well, the idea is to combine sodium with the sulfate. Well, why would you want to do that? Because it makes the sulfate combined with the sodium into something that is easily leached. So you would follow this with leaching. You would add sulfuric acid or elemental sulfur, and it would work best with the sodic soils, especially if sodium carbonate is present. So there's another reason it works best with sodic soils, to know what kind of salt-affected soil you are dealing with. Okay, so how does it actually work? Well, you add the elemental sulfur and it converts with the soil moisture into sulfuric acid. The sulfuric acid changes sodium bicarbonate into sodium sulfate, and the sodium sulfate is easily leached out of the soil profile and down into the subsoils and beyond the root zone, where it's not going to affect our crop growth anymore. So you're going to have to irrigate or flush the soil out after these kinds of treatments. One thing to note is that the soil pH will drop as a result of adding the elemental sulfur or the sulfuric acid. And since we also know that adding nitrogen fertilizers causes our soil pH to drop, just be careful about what your pH is going to be if you have this kind of treatment. We know that our soils in this part of the world are well buffered, so they're likely to rebound back to what the pH was before we did this chemical treatment. But just be aware that sometimes if you're going to use this on an ongoing basis, you might have to change what kind of crop you're growing because the pH has dropped a little bit. All right, what about this leaching method? What are we going to do with that? Well, the idea is to add enough water to flush the sodium down from the root zone and into the levels of the soil where it's no longer going to be a problem, preferably so it can drain away. Well, you said at the beginning that an indication of salt-affected soil could be poor drainage. This is true. So sometimes if you're looking at this, you must make sure that there's adequate drainage in your soil profile. So you may have to think about installing tile drains. This is not going to be a cheap option, that's for sure. So the leaching requirement can be calculated and is generally calculated for an entire field, but that's because you know that part of the field is salt affected. So what we would often do, particularly in the past, was we would take a look at what part of the field was salt affected, figure out what the level of salts were in that salt affected part of the field, and then we would calculate a leaching requirement for that salt affected part, and we would apply it to the entire field, even the parts that were not salt affected. We can change that now because we have precision irrigation. We can put as much water as we need where we need it, and we can put as much water as we need on the unsalt affected parts of our field to make sure that the crop has enough moisture to be able to grow. If we get conditions as we do in southern Alberta, where we get hot, dry summers, then water that's in the soil is going to be pulled up to the soil surface by capillary action back into the root zone. So if that water is salt affected, it's bringing those salts back up. We want them to go back down again. So you might have to do some intermittent excess irrigation, more than the crops need, just to drive those salts back down through the soil profile, particularly as the plants start to put their roots deeper and deeper into the soil profile. We can calculate the leaching requirement if we know the electrical conductivity of the irrigation water and the electrical conductivity of the drainage water. Remember, when you're using this procedure, you're needing to add water well in excess of what is needed just to moisten the soil. You're applying more than the crop needs. And in our conditions where we grow our plants in the hot, dry summers, you also need to account for what is going to evaporate from the plants and from the soil surface. You have to think about what crop is being grown. What's the quality of the irrigation water? What's its electrical conductivity? And you have to think about soil characteristics such as texture and density. Okay, so you're putting in lots of water. It's got to drain away somehow. So disposal of drainage water can be an issue. You don't want your soils to become waterlogged. Hence, good drainage is essential, and perhaps the installation of tile drains could facilitate that drainage of this water. So when you're doing this, it's a balance between applying enough excess water to force those salts down lower into the profile and drain them out of below the root zone, but also not overdoing it so that we don't put in way more than we need, because that water needs to go somewhere. All right, so if we calculate the leaching requirement, then this is what we do. It's a ratio between the electrical conductivity of the irrigation water and the electrical conductivity of the drainage water. This is most effective to use just prior to planting or immediately following planting, because you're getting the salts out of that very topmost layer of the soil, which is what you've planted into and where the seedlings are going to start growing. Young plants are very sensitive to salts. So you need to know about what you're growing, the quality of your irrigation water, and the soil characteristics for the field into which you are applying this. Can you use it just with one kind of irrigation? No, you can use it with almost any kind of irrigation. However, it may raise the water table, and it could lead to waterlogging and bringing salt back up into the root zone and increasing salinity. So be careful what you're doing with this. Again, it's a balance. You want to treat the most salt-affected areas, but you don't want to water the entire field if you can avoid it, because you're just overwatering less saline areas. And it doesn't take into consideration what the underlying substrate is. We have marine shales around here, and they're loaded with salts. So we have what we call fossil salt deposits in our soil. And if they get in contact with water like groundwater, then that saline water can move up through the soil profile and become an issue. So we don't want waterlogging. The other thing is you need to know the electrical conductivity of drainage water, but water actually moves through a soil fairly slowly. So to actually measure the electrical conductivity of that drainage water can take months or even years. So is there something else we can do? Yes, in-field sensors. You can get anything as simple as the one on the left, which just is a probe, you stick it in. It just does the very most top layer of the soil. Or you can use something like an EM38. And you can drag this EM38 across your field and create soil salinity maps. You can see, using this kind of device, where your saline patches are in your soils. These are rapid, they are continuous, and they measure soil bulk conductivity. They can work with both your shallow depth and your deeper depth to produce maps, which will give you more indication of what to do with your salt-affected soils. The biological methods, the goal there is to lower the water table below the root zone and reduce the upward movement of salts. Alfalfa is very good at this because it has very deep roots. Other things that you might consider might be growing sugar beets, barley, or rye. Anything that makes channels in the soil, because if you can think about planting these deep rooting ones to keep that water table down, and then perhaps now that you've opened up the soil a bit, perhaps you should think about adding gypsum, and then that would also help to alleviate your problem. So
Oh, we got lost.
Oh, Edith, did we lose you? I think we may have lost Edith. Yeah, we're having really poor weather here. Oh, there she is.
okay, I'm just about done here.
No worries. I was just explaining we're having poor weather here, so.
Okay. Remember that some of these things are going to be expensive, particularly if you're talking about installing tile drains that you don't already have. You might have to think about changing your crop if you're using any of the techniques that lower the soil pH, or you might want to switch your crops to something that is more salt tolerant. Otherwise, as I know some people have done, just leave the field in permanent pasture, allow some light grazing on it. Not going to break up the soil. It's not worth it from your perspective. And thank you very much for your attention today. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thanks, Edith. For everyone, just to let everyone know, we are having a little bit, I've mentioned it twice, I'll mention it a third time, we are having trouble outside. There's a fair bit of wind going on, so we might, if you do lose us, it's just the environment is not working for us today. So also Edith is, she has to run at 11 o'clock, she has another meeting. So if anybody has any questions for Edith, ask them right now in the Q&A, and she'll answer them during Stephen Tannas' presentation. So we'll get started on our next panelist. So Stephen Tannas will present on phytoremediation of nutrients in feedlots and storm ponds used in floating islands. Dr. Tannas has been working with the environmental industry for the past 20 years. He has extensive experience in reclamation, ecosystem management, rare species surveys, rangeland management, and wetlands. Dr. Tannas has been propagating native species for over 20 years as part of Eastern Slopes Rangeland Seeds and owns Tannas Conservation Services. He has worked on numerous reclamation projects restoring ecosystems across Western Canada, including restoration of fescue grasslands, bioengineering stream banks, forested reclamation, and alpine reclamation. Dr. Tannas teaches plant identification and wetlands classification courses. His PhD established a method of reestablishing foothills fescue, making it a viable species for reclamation. He has won the Alberta Emerald Award for individual commitment in 2001, as well as part of the TCS team in restoring fescue grasslands in 2014. Welcome, Stephen.
Good morning, everybody. I'll get my screen share up here. There it is. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the work I've been doing partnered with Olson College specifically. We have been working with floating islands in the greenhouse, and we are now moving into feedlot systems to look at ways to use plants to pull out nutrient loading in water bodies. And this can be a very interesting area of work that can be a passive treatment that can be very cost effective. So who am I? As mentioned, I am an environmental consultant. I've been working for over the past 35 years with my company. My parents started it, and then I came in with it. And we run specialty work in reclamation and range management. We do a lot of soils work, vegetation work throughout the province. And then I have a second company, and this is the one that does floating island systems as well as manufacturing native seed harvesting equipment. So the problem, contaminated water is becoming a serious problem, and this is worldwide. And you'll notice it when we have provincial advisories for certain lakes where algae blooms have occurred and people cannot go swimming in the lakes. Algae blooms are things that are very common, and they can be significantly related to agricultural practices. In addition to this, golf courses, urban installations, mining, all have the potential to cause eutrophication, basically nutrient loading in your water bodies. This becomes very dangerous as you deplete your oxygen. You can have smells, you can have animals killed by it. Some of the big culprits are phosphorus and nitrogen loading, but sulfates are, as mentioned in the previous one, they can be used in the soil, but if they accumulate in your water bodies, this is a problem in Saskatchewan particularly, and I'm doing some work with Dr. Finley out of Regina in sulfate accumulation in dugouts. Sulfates can be a problem if they get into your water in concentration. So keep that in mind. You may need remediation options when you're dealing with some of those contaminant type nutrients. And they're a nutrient until they get loading too high, and then they become a problem. So what can we actually remediate with phytoremediation? Phytoremediation is by definition, that using a plant to pull out the nutrients or microbial biomass. So something living is actually pulling out contaminants or nutrients out of soil or water and leaving it clean of that. Now, if you think of principles as farmers, we fertilize our crops. That there just shows the definition of we need to add nutrients into our soils because the plants are pulling them out. We're using the same philosophy in water, that certain plants can pull out a large volume of nutrients and clean our water. So it is very well established. Nitrogen, phosphorus, selenium, sulfate, and potassium all can be pulled through this process. And there's a host of other metals that can be pulled out as well. I'm going to be focusing here on nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfate, and potassium in this talk, as those are some of our bigger issues in water bodies surrounding feedlots and other wastewater that we have around rural situations. So what is a floating island system? Well, basically what it sounds like. They're an artificial platform, and they can be made in many different ways. They basically float on the water surface and let the roots of the plants penetrate into the water body and pull out nutrients directly from the water. They allow for versatile installations. You can put them almost anywhere. Depending on the island type, you can move them around. They can be in any type of water depth and fluctuating water. So they're really useful for ponds where you're going to have low and then high water conditions. They just drop down and rise with the water levels. So that is the reason we use them in situations instead of shoreline plantings, where many of the plants suddenly are out of the water for too long and then they die. You'll see around dugouts in the prairies, these areas of just bare soil as the water drops down throughout the season. Plants cannot handle that variation. You typically get plants that like dry or wet, and not ones that can handle huge fluctuations in a natural system. So we have to adapt to that. The nice thing about floating islands is we can retrofit them into any type of pond. And so we've got the bottom picture here this is in city of Lethbridge, and these are the ones being used on some of their stormwater ponds. Here's Olds College. They've taken some of the experimental ones from the greenhouse and just thrown out there, and the ducks have been grazing them off for us. That's why we put the fences on them to prevent that. And they passively treat. So basically, you have very little work to do once they start operating. The most you may have to do is remove some of the vegetation every once in a while. They do have their problems though. And this is why I have been very critical in floating island systems in the past, was we tried to buy commercially what was existing, and we found one set sunk on us. Well, that doesn't do us any good. There's another set we had up in the Olds area that geese started nesting on them and breaking them apart, and they were made out of foam. And the foam started disintegrating, and basically we had foam floating all over the water. So you get microplastic issues. So you got to think about the materials they're made of. Some foam islands require irrigation, and it makes no sense why you would be growing something on water and have to irrigate it. So design has been a serious issue in floating island systems. You need things that are developed for plant growth, not just as a commercial product. And so some of the ones can be twice as much money and they don't grow plants. So you really have to think about what you're looking at when you get into the situation of floating islands. The vegetation can be killed by animals. And here we got a picture of one that's been grazed off basically, and then one that's got a little fence around it up in the top corner. Sometimes we have to have some type of fencing system to protect the vegetation. We need that vegetation to grow to a certain level. So wetland plants, what am I doing? What am I using? One of the first things that I've been focused on is actually figuring out what plants work in Canadian climates. There's a lot of literature on cattail, but not much else that grows in Canada. So worldwide research doesn't necessarily benefit us if it's for plants that we do not grow here. So we're working with Olds College. We're trying to isolate what species are best for each contaminant form, nutrient form. Will these species grow on a floating island system or only on shorelines? And how many plants per unit area do we need for a certain amount of contaminant? So those are the big questions we've been working with. So ARF is the study at Olson College. We have 3 phases. The first is a controlled greenhouse phase with these tanks. And this is actually a picture of ARF 2. I don't have the picture of ARF 1 at the moment, but the cattail by the end of that experiment hit the ceiling of the greenhouse. So we're getting 14 feet tall. What we did in this first phase was a controlled mesocosm where we had these little islands and we loaded nutrients into the tanks and at huge volumes. We were 4 or 5 times what you'd see in a hydroponic system for plant growth, and then looked at depletion and how long it took the plants to remove those nutrients. Cattails stored more nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and sulfur in shoots than other species. And this is driven by the fact that when you look on an actual volume of production, they're highly productive. The bigger the plant, the more nutrients are needed. It follows fairly logically. The issue we'll talk about later is what happens when you're missing one nutrient. Cattails had the lowest concentrations of phosphorus, potassium, and sulfate remaining in the water. And this is really important, and used up to 10 times the evaporative rate. So if you're trying to maintain your water and use it for something, cattails might not be your solution because they can use 10 times more water than evaporation alone. So they'll drain that water away. But if you're trying to remove wastewater and don't want to have to release it, cattails could be a great solution for you. Nitrate concentrations did not differ from the control for any species other than cattail, and this was specific to some of our growing conditions. We had a problem in our control tank where we had an algae bloom, so we actually had changes in our nutrients in the first phase, and we had to adapt in our second phase to control for that problem. Phosphate concentrations remained in plant-treated water were higher than control. Algae blooms occurred. And this is something in phase 2, we had to control our algae blooms due to the nutrient loading. So here, even in the controlled greenhouse experiment, we had problems with algae blooms because of nutrient load. So we were in the right target phase of nutrient loading because it was naturally wanting to have algae blooms. Potassium dropped below control for all plant treatments, and then sulfate was lower in all species other than water sedge. So we were able to remove sulfate as well. Objectives AR2 was to see the effect of 7 species, so expanding the number of species from 4, determine water use efficiency of each species, and when we chose the species, we selected the best of phase 1 and then added new species. Determine potential for each species to be used in floating island systems and test the constructed wetland using feedlot effluent. So now we're going from lab control to actually using real world situation water. So this water was low in nitrates. So just specifically the water we were dealing with that we got for the tanks was low in nitrogen, and as such did affect how plants grow. It's a batch mesocosm style tank with floating islands custom built. And you can see the islands here. We use peat moss as our growing medium. So we're using a natural growing medium. There is nutrients. There's in real world situation, you're not going to use just sterile foam. So we use something that plants grow well in and have a growing medium that works for them. And then we put in 5 plants per island with 24 treatment tanks to get replication and 3 control tanks. And then we had bubblers to oxygenate. So we were keeping this as an oxygen-rich system. The plants were installed in November 2019, and we grew them through the winter with basically no nutrients. And this went until spring, and then COVID hit, and everything shut down. So we went until mid-July before we actually ran the experiment. So these plants went from little plugs that are in here to mature plants in that time frame. So when we started treatment, we were dealing with more mature plants. We started the experiment in July and ran it through till October. And here are the species we had. So we had some of our big sedges. Anybody in the prairies, this Pteryx athroides wheat sedge is one of the main sedges you'll see in your wetlands. We had smartweed, common cattail, mare's tail, water sedge, which is more in the foothills and parkland regions, Baltic rush, which is a nitrogen fixer, and small fruited bulrush. So a mixture of wetland species. The idea is trying to find the best species for each area. The water was used from the old college feedlot holding pond, and here it is right here. Unfortunately, there was not a lot of animals in it immediately prior to this happening, I think. And so we had lower nitrogen levels in there, but we did sample our water so we knew what we were getting into, and sampled all the plant materials prior to the experiment. We did see nitrogen levels were lower in the water, and they dropped dramatic. They're below detection limits. So we were having low nitrogen conditions. So this is a really good situation to understand. Sometimes you'll be missing nitrogen but have a lot of phosphorus, potassium. What is the result of that when you're trying to clear out phosphorus? Well, in the end, what happened, Cattail did not perform nearly as well. So our cattail, when it was 4 or 5 times the size of everything else in the first experiment, went down and was actually substantially smaller than some of our sedges and bulrush. So cattail did not do well in that low nitrogen situation. So if you're using cattail for remediation, you may have to fertilize nitrogen to it to pull out some of your other contaminants because it's not functioning if it doesn't have a balance. In contrast, Baltic brush, which is a nitrogen fixer, was our second biggest, and it's not known to be the biggest plant in natural wetlands, but when given the right contaminants, it can be a very aggressive growing species. So understand how plant growth is affected by the nutrient regimes you have. And you see the little bit of yellow nature in these plants. This is right near senescence, but not high nitrogen conditions. And the darker green of the Baltic brush back in here. So Baltic brush, tillering, it did way better. And also mare's tail performed very well. Wheat sedge started to grow quite rapidly. And then after that, water sedge. Otherwise, tillering, the other species were not really good at performing. When we looked at phosphorus, we can see the red here is our control. And we can see we had significant drops in phosphorus in everything, even cattail, even if it was limited. All the species perform fairly similarly other than pondweed. Pondweed is one I probably would not recommend for most of these situations because it was not as effective in its growth. When we looked at the shoots of the plants themselves, you can see phosphorus in our water sedge was the highest. And if you have the same letter, it means the significance is the same. So all the ones with A's were significantly higher and the same as the water sedge. Anything with B is all equal. So cattail is the only one that was significantly lower than your wheat sedge, pondweed, and water sedge. So when we're talking about low nitrogen conditions, cattail is not a good performer, even though it was one of the best in the first phase. So know your environment and how you have to manipulate it based on the species you have. In the soil, pondweed, you can see, had more in the soil, so it wasn't taking it up into the plant, where most of these other ones were just down here with the control. We didn't have an accumulation in the soil, which is important to understand. When we looked at nitrogen in the shoots, Baltic brush at the highest, well, it makes sense, it's a nitrogen fixer. The wheat sedge and water sedge were pulling out nitrogen, so they were finding it, and mare's tail was too, and it might be a nitrogen fixer. I'd have to check again. Cattail and pondweed did not do well in this situation. So this shows really when you have low nitrogen conditions, what you need to be considering. In the soils, again, not much variation, but you can see cattail had depleted below the control. So did the small fruit bulrush, wheat sedge, and water sedge. And when we look at potassium in the water, our red dotted line here is the control. You can see that for most part, we've reduced no matter what species it is. Worst performers were the pondweed again, and the water sedge was a little higher here, but generally was fairly normal. So this could be just a little bit of error. It might be just how the sampling was taken, but in general, all the other species were effective. Most effective, cattail still held out as one of the best in potassium removal. So when we looked in the shoots, cattail had the highest in the shoots. So it really does like potassium. Mare's tail did very well. And then we have small fruited bulrush and wheat sedge following it up, with water sedge and Baltic brush being the lowest. And this is something to pay attention to, because obviously then if it's not in the shoots, then you can't harvest it off of the system. or it's just simply not taking up as effectively. Potassium in the soils control, you can see here, we had a reduction in potassium in the soils. The plants, no matter which one, were pulling potassium out of the soils, just like water. Sulfate, we had a really interesting situation here. So sulfate was in the tap water that was actually being used in the experiment. So from the beginning, you can see the control actually not doubled, significantly went up in sulfate. All of the other plants doing the same. And you wonder, why are these plants getting more sulfate than they had originally? When you have evapotranspiration, these plants, such as the Baltic rush, the wheat sedge, cattail, are all using significantly more water because the plant's pulling water out and it's transpiring out of the plants than evaporation alone, which is just the control. So we actually end up putting more water in, and that's helping concentrate sulfate. So we did have a problem there, and that is a lesson for experiments. Is if we were using distilled water, but the amount of distilled water we had to use was so significant that we just couldn't do it in this size of an experiment. So we were trapped with tap water, and so it did confound our sulfates in the water. Now, when we looked in the plants, they were getting a lot more sulfate. You can see mare's tails really pulls sulfate. Then we also had a small fruited bulrush effective, where all the other species were kind of the same. So even though we weren't effective in our water because we were adding sulfate, we are able to see which plants have the best potential to pull sulfate out. And then water use. Water use, you can see here as we went from the summer into fall, even though we're in a greenhouse, we had a drop in the amount of water use, but you can see the plants use significantly more water. So we're not looking double in this experiment because we didn't have enough nitrogen, but we are still looking at 1.5 times in a lot of the species. So if you want species that are going to not use up your water, mare's tail, pondweed are effective at that, and and then cattail to some degree when there's no nitrogen. But when cattail has nitrogen, it is the highest user. So think about the side consequences of what you're doing. So what do we learn from this? Higher nutrient loading resulted in increased plant growth. We found nutrient deficiencies may have limited growth, nitrogen specifically on cattail. Cattail, water sedge, and wheat sedge, plant heights and pillars were nearly doubled trial 1 to 2, so they were all suppressed. During senescence, at the end of the growing season, removal of nutrient drops off. So this happens in the summer, but in the winter, you're going to accumulate nutrients. So that is something to think about in your design. So what did we find for phosphorus? Was removed very effectively. Removal of 77 to 84% of phosphorus removed. And that's higher than reported in previous scientific literature, which is around 49%. So that we were effectively removing phosphorus. The phosphorus storage locations differ by species. Some are in the roots, some in the shoots. So you want to choose plants to put them in the shoots so that you can harvest it off and remove it. And that phosphorus could be used as feed even. It can be used for almost anything, green manure. It's just taking it out of that water. And concentration of phosphorus in shoots is only a portion of the consideration. The removal per square meter basis is critical. And so we do have numbers associating with that from this analysis. Nitrogen removal, historically 58% removal rates. We didn't have much nitrogen in phase 2, but phase 1, we were seeing this type of removal, and cattail was very effective at it. Potassium, 27 to 45% removal. Plants, as a plant material degrades, though, you could put it back in the water. So harvesting the plants off in the fall and taking that material away from the water is necessary to guarantee that you're draining the nutrient loads out of the water. Sulfate, we did have an increase, but we did have some plants that were effective in controlling sulfate. So it's really important to understand that we can actually remove sulfate with certain species. Dr. Finley out of Regina, I'm working with her and on her dugout sulfate work. So hopefully we'll have floating islands working on dugouts to see if we can pull sulfates out of water that is loaded with sulfate. So recommendations, what I recommend in the experimental design for our phase 3 was assessing we need to focus on colder climates, testing our nitrogen more fully. We think some of the nitrogen was escaping us because the test wasn't complete in this phase 2, but phase 1 we were able to get the full complement of nitrogen assessed. Account for the biomass in nutrient accumulation a little better, and so we can run better calculations on nutrient loading and how much nutrients we can remove. And we're moving into our phase 3 research. So we have 4 feedlots we're working with. We're going to be working right on the feedlots, on the ponds, and we're looking at if we can reduce the nutrient loading in those ponds, and basically allowing, if we can clean the water to a certain level, you can release water. So this is to see if we can, in practical terms, help create a system where you can actually clean and release water more effectively in agricultural operations, as well as stormwater, golf courses, all those type of situations where you have high nutrient loading. We have started the water sampling. The islands will be installed this summer or in the fall, and goal is looking at the real life conditions. So what can you do and how can this be used? Well, if you're designing a pond system, one of the things that is done a lot in urban areas is creating swales. And instead of just having a pipe and all the water goes through the pipe to your pond, if you can create a very gentle swale system that's like a vegetated ditch, or almost a level area in places where it's very shallow water that sits in there, that water can then have plants growing through it, and then you are going to be able to remove nutrients through that system. You're also, the plants filter and clean the water as well, and you may have to come through there and clean it out every once in a while, but it's a very good way to actually remediate kind of the nutrient loading, and basically fertilizing your vegetation is what you're doing. Another option is then when you don't have any shorelines and swales and areas, constructed wetland areas, you don't have the room for it or don't have them built, you can also put it on these installations of islands. And on the very top here is a mine where we're pulling out selenium, and we're pulling out about 30% of the selenium. It's started at 15 to 20%. Now it's getting up to 30% of the selenium. And that's actually reducing the selenium loading below the safe criteria. So now it's a micronutrient beneficial to the system, not loading the system. Same thing for nutrients. If we can put them on these ponds, we can pull down the nutrient loads, stop algae blooms, stop the smell, and start actually creating a system that is more functional. And when you're selecting islands, really important to look at things that are winter weather compatible. So these islands are foam core with metal casing and then plastic, a hard plastic, kind of like a box liner that is encasing that. And they can go under ice. They can basically have ice sink them to the bottom of the pond. They just pop back up in the spring, and the vegetation is fine even through that. So building, using islands that can have versatility. This one down at the bottom is a nesting island for geese, used to kind of protect the other islands, put the geese on something it likes, and it'll territorial keep them off the ones right next to it. So we have these options to build in on islands. This is more expensive. It is best when you can design for the vegetation from the beginning to help protect everything. And that is the end of my presentation. And if there's any questions, we can address them right now.
Thanks, Stephen. That was great. I know Lethbridge County we've invested in a few in those in Stevens Islands at the Broxton Park. If anyone is interested in seeing them in person, you're more than welcome to just venture off to the ponds there. I see we have a few questions, so we'll get started here. Just so everyone knows, Edith had to leave just a couple minutes ago there. So, Stephen, it looks like your islands are monocultures. Have you tried polyculture planting, and are you adding non-native species?
So, to date, we've been using monoculture specifically for testing, because when we're trying to test the roots, you can't go under the island and differentiate which root comes from which species. So in our ones that we're doing scientific testing in, monocultures. In Lethbridge County, as well as City of Lethbridge, those are all mixtures. So we took our best performing species and created a mixture to actually, it's aesthetically more pleasing, but also then it allows us to get a more full complement of nutrients, and we can adjust the composition for the nutrients we're removing. And non-native species, I guess, was part of that. We've avoided non-native species for the most part, specifically trying to avoid really weedy species. But that said, Olds College was doing an edible island. So things with all edible plants that grow in water.
Oh.
So they had lettuces, tomatoes, kale, all kinds of stuff like that. If you do that and you want to be able to eat it, first you got to test the water, make sure it's just nutrient loading and not metals, because you don't want to have heavy metals or something else. But if it's just nutrients, you can go ahead and do that, but you need to protect it from the ducks, because the ducks on Olds College had a heyday with it, except for the kale. They would not eat the kale. But yeah, so looking at some other non-native species, we do, but evaluating if they're going to be a weed is very important for the situation. So anything that's not going to be a weed is definitely fair game to use.
Or did you see a question there, Steven?
So there's one here. Do you remove the islands in the winter? So I have created islands. So the ones that I manufacture, we've tested them in Grand Cache. So they're in mountains in pretty severe conditions. Also on our dugout at our farm here and locally, as well as Lethbridge, we actually had them freeze into the ice and drop to the bottom of the pond when ice dropped under the water, and they just popped up in the spring. So not all islands will do this, but making sure you're selecting the right ones that can be just left in the water is really important for long-term use. Certain ones can be moved around. Ours, I've hit it with a truck, and the truck did cause a little tiny nick in it and didn't actually break through the plastic. So I actually drove a truck over it and it still wouldn't damage it. So the ice impacts are nothing to these.
We do have a question in the chat there too, Stephen. So have you considered testing the nutrient load in the harvested plant material for use as a compost material?
So yeah, so all that material that we were, all those tests and the figures of the shoots have nutrient load compositions to them, and all of them would have been fantastic for composting. So that's why I say you could use them as a green manure, even where you till them into your soils. You can compost them down and use them as compost. A lot of options they can use as feed. So as long as we're not dealing with heavy metal issues, we're able to use for nutrient loading in agricultural systems. Pretty much that vegetation can be used.
We have one more question for you there, Stephen, in the Q&A. Oh, I don't know that word. I don't know how to say that one word, but
yeah. So the Hyanthus,
yeah.
Creeping Jenny, there are a number, and that's the thing is there's a lot of vegetation out there. We've got now, I think, 30 species sampled. There's a lot of plants that grow in water, and tame ones. You can. I know Olds College was going to do a display island, and they haven't done it yet with some of the tame, really ornamental species as well. So as long as the species is not a weed that's going to escape on you and cause problems, pretty much go at it and you can use them. Another one that I would love to see is the native Phragmites, but the fear is because there's the invasive one that's on the prohibited noxious list, telling them apart is very difficult. So you want to lean away from something that could be a problem that way. Olds College has wild rice growing. So there is a lot of really cool species, ones that are ornamental that look great. My idea of pondweeds is they creep off the island and float on the water. So there's lots of things that we can do to be aesthetically pleasing while actually being very effective in nutrient removal. So you can actually gain two different things at the same time. Okay, the island's blowing around. That is a really good question. So in Lethbridge, City of Lethbridge, we put in islands and they use cinder blocks with chains as anchors. And they did not put enough chain anchor, and they weren't actually anchored down, with just the weight of them. And the first set that they did that, they blew around. The second time they had to come back, put on more anchors, and then they fixed in place. If you're able to put a post into the water, then you can just anchor them to that post. I anchor along mine to shoreline so I can bring them out of the water and or to the edge of the water to work with and test on them. So a lot of times we anchor to a shoreline, but you have all those options to either anchor right in water or to a shoreline, depending on your needs. If there's a liner in the pond, you can't put a post through it, so then we use cinder block anchors. Yeah, and then we're actually now, our native plant nursery, we're growing on water. So with these islands, we actually grow crops on the water. So there's options. Water lilies. Water lilies are one that you could actually use. Like we have them growing here just west of our place, Cremona, so northwest of Calgary, and they like to be underwater. So they would be a really good shoreline planting, and they can be beautiful. Some of the islands may actually grow them fairly effectively as well. I haven't tested them directly, but anything like water lilies would be a great species, emergent vegetation that you can plant, put into your water. There's some buttercups that are native that'll create mats in the water and pull out nutrients as well. And then you can just use a rake and pull them off and then compost them. So there's some ones that can just grow in the water as well. So definitely a consideration.
I see we have another chat in or question in the chat. So how did you deal with the water load in the material removed for testing?
How did I deal with, say that again?
How did you deal with the water load in the material removed for testing?
So for the testing, what they do, the labs, is they take the material, they dry it out so it's perfectly dry, and we take then we get the dry weight and the wet weight. We know how much water was in that material, and then they use the dry material for the analysis. So it's important because these plants can have a lot of water in them. The surface of the plants are usually rinsed off as we go through submitting them. So you rinse them with distilled water to take anything off the surface, and then you weigh them as wet material. Then you get the dry weight back from the lab, and you can tell how much content of water was in them, and then the lab uses dry weight to actually do the analysis.
Are there any more questions for Stephen? Looks to be good.
Yeah, and if anybody has questions about the islands, that GP Restoration Solutions, our company, has on the website a bunch of pamphlets and information that you can access on them. And we do this in Alberta. Saskatoon, City of Saskatoon has some. So we're working right in Western Canada on these islands, built for Canadian situations for the most part.
Do you have time for one more, Stephen?
Sure.
Okay, I see it's in the Q&A there.
Oh. So for this type of situation, a lot of dugouts are just really deep and really quick. So you have walls broken off and it's really deep. The best is that if you can create one edge that's going to be a shallow area. So our dugout has this. We have our deep zone, and then we have on one side kind of a shallow zone that's all wetland plants growing in the water. Much cheaper than installing the islands to start with. So even though I built the islands, I recommend do everything possible in the design to avoid having to put the islands in. So if you can create like a shallow zone where the water will, before the water spills out of the dugout, if it's going to overflow out, then you have a shallow zone that the plants can grow in. If you're in a prairie situation where it's a really deep dugout and you may not have the ability to choose a shallow zone because the fluctuation might be too much. But our dugout, because we have an overflow and almost like a reservoir where it flows out every spring, we always know the starting depth. And so we were able to set that shallow area that is all sedges growing on the outside edges.
Well, that's awesome. Thanks, Stephen, for coming and participating in our webinar series today. It's much appreciated. I know you're fairly busy. You got a lot of research going on, so.
Yeah, I'm working with lots of stuff.
Yeah. I would like to thank everyone that was able to join us here today. I appreciate everyone that was able to stick around for the hour or so. Edith and Stephen, thank you so much for presenting to everyone here today.
Yeah.
Anyone that's looking for CEU credits, just stick around to the very end here. But please join us again next Monday, February 7th at 10 o'clock a.m. Mountain Central Time for the final webinar where Trevor Wallace from Alberta Agriculture, Forestry, and Rural Economic Development will present on regulations of spreading and storing manure, and Rob Lavoie from Airterra will present on use of biochar and feedlots. So thanks everyone, and until next time.